Nam Cao was a university student in Saigon when the Tet Offensive shattered the illusion that the war would stay somewhere else. And over the next 7 years, he would become a naval engineer, a combat veteran, a refugee on a leaking boat crossing dangerous waters, and finally, an American, starting over from nothing in a country he had never seen. This is one of those stories that sticks with you because it's not really about politics or grand strategy or the decisions made in Washington or Hanoi. It's about a regular person trying to make decisions when the ground keeps shifting under his feet, when nothing is certain, and every choice could be the one that gets you killed or the one that saves your life. And, honestly, that's what most of the Vietnam War was actually like for the people who lived through it. The millions of ordinary Vietnamese and Americans who got caught up in something much bigger than themselves. Nam Cao's journey from a college campus in South Vietnam to a new life in the United States tells us something important about resilience, about the choices people make when their country is falling apart around them, about what it actually takes to rebuild when everything you knew and everyone you loved and every plan you had for your future is suddenly gone. So let's slow down and really look at how this one man's life intersected with one of the most turbulent and tragic periods in modern history. Because understanding the Vietnam War means understanding the individual human beings who experienced it, not just the generals and politicians, but the students and sailors and refugees whose names never made it into the history books. Vietnam in the late 1960s was a country that had been at war, in one form or another, for longer than most of its young people could remember. The French had colonized Vietnam in the 19th century, had been driven out by the Japanese during World War II, had come back after the war ended, and fought a brutal conflict to maintain their empire, and had finally been defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, in one of the most stunning military upsets of the century. After the French left, the country had been divided at the 17th parallel as part of the Geneva Accords, a temporary arrangement that was supposed to lead to elections and reunification, but instead became a permanent division between the Communist North and the anti-Communist South. The South was led by a series of governments that were authoritarian and often corrupt, but aligned with the United States, which saw Vietnam as a crucial battleground in the global Cold War struggle against communism. The North was led by Ho Chi Minh, the revolutionary who had fought against the French and who now was determined to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. And in the South itself, the Viet Cong, communist guerrillas supported by the North, were waging an insurgency against the government, assassinating officials, terrorizing villages, and slowly expanding their control over the countryside. The Americans had started with just a few advisors in the late 1950s, then gradually increased their commitment until by 1968 there were more than 500,000 American troops in Vietnam, fighting a war that seemed to have no end and no clear path to victory. For a young man like Nam Cao, all of this was just the backdrop of daily life, the water he swam in, so constant and pervasive that it was almost impossible to imagine anything different. You went to school, you studied engineering or law or medicine. You tried to have some kind of normal existence, even though the news was full of battles and body counts and political crises and coups. The government in Saigon changed so often that keeping track of who was actually in charge required effort. There had been the Diem years, then the chaos after Diem was overthrown and killed in a coup that the Americans had tacitly supported, then a rotating cast of generals and politicians until finally Nguyen Van Thieu emerged as the dominant figure, ruling with American backing, but never quite able to build the kind of legitimacy that might have made the South Vietnamese state sustainable in the long run. The South Vietnamese government had a student deferment system. somewhat similar to what existed in the United States at the same time. And as long as you were enrolled in university and maintaining your academic standing, you could avoid being drafted into the military. Nam Cao was taking advantage of that deferment, pursuing his education in engineering and hoping, like a lot of young men on both sides of the Pacific in those years, that the war might somehow end or wind down before he had to get involved directly. Students in classrooms, studying. The deferment system created a kind of class divide, because the young men who could afford to go to university were mostly from middle-class or wealthy families, while the poor and the rural population had fewer options and ended up carrying more of the burden of actually fighting the war. This was true in America too, where the draft deferments for college students meant that the combat units were disproportionately filled with young men who couldn't afford to stay in school or didn't have the academic qualifications to get into college. In both countries, the system was unfair. But in both countries, if you had the option to defer, you took it, because no one wanted to die in a war that no one seemed able to explain clearly or win decisively. Nam Cao studied, attended his classes, lived his life in Saigon, and watched the war from a distance that felt safe, at least most of the time. Then came Tet, and the distance collapsed. The Tet Offensive of 1968 was supposed to be a surprise, a massive, coordinated attack that would show the people of South Vietnam that the communists were strong and that the American presence couldn't protect them. And in many ways it succeeded in delivering that message, but not in the way the communist leadership had hoped or expected. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had been planning for months, infiltrating fighters and weapons into cities and towns across South Vietnam, hiding them in safe houses and tunnels, waiting for the signal to attack. That signal came during the Lunar New Year holiday, traditionally a time of ceasefire when both sides stood down and people traveled to be with their families. The communists exploited the holiday truce, launching attacks on more than 100 cities and towns simultaneously, hitting targets that people had assumed were safe, bringing the war into places that had never seen combat before. In Saigon itself, Viet Cong sappers attacked the American embassy compound, blowing a hole in the wall and fighting inside the grounds for hours before being killed or captured. The images of the fighting at the embassy were broadcast around the world and created a sensation in the United States, where people had been told that the war was going well and that victory was within sight. How could the enemy attack the American embassy if the war was really being won? Other parts of Saigon saw intense combat too, with Viet Cong fighters emerging from their hiding places and engaging South Vietnamese and American forces in the streets. The old imperial capital of Hue, in the central part of the country, was captured entirely by the communists and had to be retaken block by block in weeks of brutal urban fighting that left the city devastated. For Nam Cao in Saigon, the Tet Offensive was terrifying in a very specific and personal way that the more distant fighting in the countryside had never been. You could be walking down a street, going about your normal business, and suddenly find yourself caught in a crossfire between two groups of fighters who looked exactly the same. The Viet Cong didn't wear uniforms that made them easy to identify in the chaos of urban combat. They were Vietnamese, just like the people they were fighting against, and they dressed like civilians, and emerged from civilian buildings and disappeared back into the civilian population when the pressure got too intense. Telling friend from enemy was almost impossible unless someone was actively shooting at you, and even then the confusion was overwhelming. The communists had spent years building networks in the South, recruiting among the poor and the disaffected, spreading their ideology through patient organizing and occasional demonstrations of force. They had developed a sophisticated underground apparatus that could move people and weapons and information across the country, despite the best efforts of the South Vietnamese security services to root them out. When the Tet attacks began, the communist leadership expected that the people of South Vietnam would see the strength of the revolution and rise up to join them, that the Saigon government would collapse, that the Americans would realize the futility of their intervention, and that the war would effectively be over. That general uprising never came. The people of South Vietnam, whatever they thought about their government and whatever sympathies some of them might have had for the communist cause, mostly just tried to survive and stay out of the way. They had seen too much war already to be enthusiastic about joining a new phase of it, and the brutality of the communist forces in places like Hue, where they executed thousands of people deemed enemies of the revolution, did not help their cause. Militarily, the Tet offensive was actually a disaster for the communists. They had committed their best forces, the experienced cadres who had spent years building those underground networks, and those forces were decimated. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the South was gutted and never really recovered. From a purely military standpoint, the Americans and South Vietnamese had won. But even though Tet was a military defeat for the communists, it was a psychological and political turning point that changed everything. In the United States, people watched the fighting on television, saw the chaos and the destruction, heard the reports of how the enemy that was supposed to be on the verge of defeat had instead launched a massive offensive that reached the American embassy itself, and they started to question whether the war could ever really be won. President Johnson, who had sent 500,000 troops to Vietnam and staked his presidency on the war, announced that he would not seek re-election. The anti-war movement grew stronger. The national consensus that had supported the intervention began to fracture in ways that would never fully heal. For Nam Cao and other young South Vietnamese, the message of Tet was different but equally sobering. The war wasn't going to stay in the countryside anymore. It could come to you wherever you were, in your neighborhood, on your street, in the market where you bought your food. The student deferment that had seemed like such a good deal suddenly felt a lot less secure, because what good was avoiding the draft if the war came to find you anyway? The government was clearly unable to protect the cities. The Americans were clearly unable to win the war decisively, and the future that had seemed reasonably stable just a few weeks earlier now looked frighteningly uncertain. Life went on, though, because what else could it do? Nam Cao continued his studies. The immediate crisis of Tet passed. The bodies were buried and the rubble was cleared, and the routines of daily life resumed. The war settled back into its grinding rhythm of search and destroy operations in the jungle, bombing campaigns against the north, peace talks in Paris that never seemed to go anywhere meaningful. But something had changed, and everyone knew it. The Americans started talking about Vietnamization, this policy of gradually transferring responsibility for the fighting to the South Vietnamese military so that American troops could go home. Richard Nixon had been elected president partly on the promise that he would end the war, and Vietnamization was supposed to be the way to do it. The idea was to train the South Vietnamese forces, give them the equipment they needed, provide them with enough support to stand on their own, and then gradually withdraw the American combat troops who had been carrying so much of the burden. Whether this was ever really going to work is a question that historians still argue about decades later. The South Vietnamese military had real problems: corruption and poor leadership, and a top-heavy officer corps selected more for political loyalty than military competence. But it also had units that fought bravely and effectively, and soldiers who were willing to die for their country. What the South Vietnamese military could not do was replace the enormous logistical and firepower advantages that the American presence provided. The Americans had B-52 bombers that could devastate North Vietnamese positions. They had helicopter gunships and artillery and an endless supply of ammunition and fuel and spare parts. They had advisors who could call in airstrikes and coordinate operations. All of that was supposed to continue even after the combat troops left. But as the American withdrawal accelerated and as the political will to support South Vietnam eroded in Washington, the supplies became less reliable and the support became more grudging. Nam Cao graduated from university in 1970, and with his deferment expired, he joined the Republic of Vietnam Navy. It wasn't the infantry, which was probably a relief, and his engineering background meant he would be working with machinery rather than patrolling through jungles where ambushes could come from any direction. The Navy was not the most glamorous branch of the South Vietnamese military, but it played a crucial role in a country where so much of the terrain was defined by water, by the rivers that flowed through the Mekong Delta and the coastline that stretched for thousands of kilometers. The Navy assigned Nam Cao to Ben Luc, a facility where old ships were overhauled and supply operations were run. This was in the Mekong Delta region, south of Saigon, where the rivers were the highways and the Navy played an essential role in moving supplies to Army of the Republic of Vietnam troops operating in the area. The Delta was a watery landscape of rice paddies and canals and mangrove swamps, incredibly fertile but also incredibly difficult to control. The Viet Cong had been strong in the Delta since the beginning of the war, and despite years of effort, the government had never managed to secure the region completely. The rivers were the lifelines that kept the military operations going, and the Navy's job was to keep those rivers open and to move the food and ammunition and equipment that the soldiers needed. The work at Ben Luc was technical and demanding. The South Vietnamese Navy was operating a mix of vessels, many of them hand-me-downs from the Americans, boats and ships that had already seen years of hard use and required constant maintenance to keep them running. Nam Cao was an engineer now, not a student anymore, and his job was to make sure these boats could do what they needed to do, could carry their cargoes and mount their weapons and navigate the treacherous waterways without breaking down at the worst possible moment. He learned the mechanical systems inside and out, learned how to diagnose problems from the sounds an engine made, learned to improvise repairs when the proper parts weren't available because the supply chain was unreliable or the budget was tight. But being assigned to a maintenance facility didn't mean staying safely behind the lines, because in the Mekong Delta, there really weren't any safe lines. Even engineers had to participate in the supply runs that kept the whole operation going, riding on the boats that carried supplies to forward positions, learning firsthand what it meant to operate in contested territory. The rivers of the Mekong Delta were contested space, where the Viet Cong maintained a constant presence. They controlled significant areas along the waterways, had positions hidden in the vegetation along the banks, could mass forces for ambushes and then disperse back into the civilian population before the counterattack arrived. Any boat moving through had to be prepared for the possibility of contact, had to have its weapons ready and its crew alert, had to know where the dangerous stretches were and how to react when the shooting started. Nam Cao learned things during those supply runs that they definitely didn't teach in engineering school. Skills that seem strange, but were actually quite practical in that environment. He learned to tell the difference between the sound of an AK-47 and the sound of an M16, which might seem like a trivial distinction, but was actually quite useful when you were trying to understand a tactical situation. The AK-47 was the standard weapon of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, a Soviet-designed rifle with a distinctive rattling bark that experienced soldiers could recognize instantly. The M16 was what the American and South Vietnamese forces carried, with a higher-pitched crack that sounded noticeably different from the AK. When you were on a boat and you heard gunfire, knowing which side was shooting could help you figure out what was happening around you, whether you were in the middle of an ambush or whether friendly forces were engaging the enemy, whether you should take cover or join the fight. The supply convoys followed routes that were never entirely secure, no matter how many times they had been traveled before. Sometimes the rivers would be blocked, either by debris that the Viet Cong had placed to channel boats into kill zones, or by enemy positions that were too strong to push through with the forces at hand. When that happened, the convoy would halt, take cover as best it could, and call for support. Sometimes that support came in the form of ground troops, who could engage the enemy positions from the flanks. Sometimes it meant calling in an airstrike, coordinating with American or South Vietnamese aircraft to drop ordnance on the positions that were blocking the river. Nam Cao watched this process many times, watched the aircraft come in and deliver their payloads on positions along the riverbanks, watched the explosions and the smoke and the destruction, and then watched the convoy continue on its way, passing through landscapes that had been transformed by high explosives just moments before. It was a strange way to live, routine and terror mixed together in ways that became almost normal after a while. You learned to function in that environment, or you didn't last. The convoys had to get through because the troops depended on the supplies, and so the convoys kept going, day after day, taking casualties and taking fire and delivering the goods anyway. This was the reality of the war at this stage, a grinding conflict fought over the same ground again and again, where controlling a stretch of river on Tuesday didn't mean you would control it on Thursday. The Viet Cong were stubborn and resilient, able to absorb enormous losses and keep fighting, while the South Vietnamese and Americans were trying to hold territory and maintain security over an area too large to garrison completely. The era of Vietnamization was in full swing now, and the Americans were pulling back, transferring more and more responsibility to the South Vietnamese military. Every few months, another American unit would pack up and leave, another base would be handed over, another piece of the war would become entirely a South Vietnamese responsibility. The theory was that the South Vietnamese military was ready to stand on its own, that it had been trained and equipped and could hold the line against the communists without American combat troops doing the heavy fighting. In practice, it was considerably more complicated than that. The South Vietnamese were losing access not just to American soldiers, but to the enormous logistical infrastructure that the Americans had built over years of effort. Air support became less available as American squadrons were withdrawn. Spare parts became harder to find, as the supply chain that had been optimized to serve American forces was redirected toward other priorities. Ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, all of these things that had flowed freely when the Americans were running the show became harder to get as the withdrawal continued and as the political situation in Washington turned increasingly hostile to continued support for the war. Nam Cao saw this from his position as an engineer responsible for keeping boats operational. The boats needed parts, and the parts were harder to find. The engines needed specialized repairs, and the American technicians who had the expertise to do the really complicated work were boarding planes and heading back to the States. The Vietnamese engineers did what they could, improvised when they had to, kept the fleet running through ingenuity and determination, but it was an uphill battle that got harder with each passing month. After some time at Ben Luc, the Navy transferred Nam Cao to a different facility, one closer to Saigon, where the South Vietnamese Navy had their own overhaul operation. The Americans had a major facility at Subic Bay in the Philippines, where they did heavy maintenance and repairs on their naval vessels. work that was too complex or too time-consuming to do in the combat zone. South Vietnamese ships would sometimes be sent there for overhauls that couldn't be done locally, but the Navy was also trying to build up its own capability, to develop Vietnamese expertise that could handle more and more of the maintenance burden without depending on the Americans. This was part of Vietnamization too, building local capacity so that the South Vietnamese could sustain their military operations independently. Nam Cao was fascinated by the training equipment that the American engineers from General Motors had brought with them to support this capacity-building effort. There were cutaway engines, actual working engines that had been sliced open so you could see all the internal components and understand how they worked together, how the fuel and air mixed in the carburetor, how the spark plugs fired, how the pistons moved, and the crankshaft turned. For someone with an engineering background, this was remarkable educational equipment. You could see the parts that were normally hidden inside solid blocks of metal, could watch them move, and understand their relationships in a way that was impossible from just reading a manual. The engineers from General Motors were there as part of the American advisory effort, teaching Vietnamese technicians how to maintain and repair the engines that powered their fleet, transferring knowledge that the South Vietnamese would need to keep their navy operational after the Americans left. Nam Cao absorbed everything he could, knowing that these skills would serve him well regardless of what happened with the war, that mechanical expertise was valuable in any economy and any situation. He was building competence that would last, even as the political and military situation around him continued to deteriorate in ways that were becoming harder to ignore. And what was happening with the war was not good. By the early 1970s, the American combat role was winding down rapidly, but the fighting continued as intense as ever. The North Vietnamese had used the years of negotiation in Paris to rebuild their forces, to infiltrate more troops and equipment into the south via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to prepare for the next phase of their campaign. The Paris Peace Accords were finally signed in January 1973, after years of negotiations that had dragged on through bombing halts and renewed offensives and diplomatic maneuvering. The accords were supposed to bring peace, or at least a ceasefire that would allow the fighting to stop and the political questions to be resolved through negotiation. American prisoners of war were released and came home to emotional reunions. The last American combat troops departed Vietnam, ending direct American military involvement in the war. But everyone who understood the situation knew that the Paris Accords were really just a pause, a diplomatic fiction that allowed the Americans to leave with some appearance of honor, while the underlying conflict remained unresolved. The North Vietnamese had agreed to stop fighting as a way to get the Americans out, but they had no intention of giving up their goal of reunifying Vietnam under communist rule. The ceasefire was violated almost immediately, and within months, the fighting had resumed at previous levels, only now without American troops to help the South Vietnamese. The Saigon government knew this too, and they prepared as best they could for the next phase of the war, the phase they would have to fight alone. Nam Cao continued his work at the naval facility, maintaining ships and keeping the fleet operational, while the political and military situation deteriorated around him in ways that were impossible to miss. The Watergate scandal consumed the Nixon administration in the United States, dominating the news and distracting the American government from everything else, including the continuing war in Vietnam. When Nixon was finally forced to resign in August 1974, whatever personal commitment he had had to supporting South Vietnam left with him. The new president, Gerald Ford, had no particular investment in Vietnam and faced a Congress that was increasingly unwilling to fund what looked like a lost cause. American support for South Vietnam, already reduced from its peak levels, became even more uncertain and unreliable. The North Vietnamese watched all of this carefully, gauging American resolve, testing South Vietnamese defenses, building up their forces for the final push that they knew was coming. That final push came in early 1975. The North Vietnamese launched a major offensive in the Central Highlands in March, expecting hard fighting and a slow advance. To the shock of almost everyone, including the North Vietnamese themselves, the South Vietnamese defenses collapsed far faster than anyone had anticipated. President Thieu, facing pressure on multiple fronts and uncertain about where to commit his limited reserves, made the fateful decision to abandon the Central Highlands and pull his forces back to more defensible positions along the coast. The retreat turned into a rout. The roads became clogged with soldiers and civilians fleeing south, creating traffic jams that paralyzed movement. Units that were supposed to conduct an orderly withdrawal instead disintegrated, their soldiers abandoning their equipment and their units to try to save themselves and their families. The chaos fed on itself, with each new disaster creating more panic and more disintegration. Cities that were supposed to hold for weeks fell in days, sometimes without serious fighting, as the defenders lost the will to resist or simply melted away. Da Nang, the second-largest city in South Vietnam, fell in chaos as soldiers and civilians fought each other to get on the evacuation ships. Whole army units dissolved, their soldiers throwing away their uniforms and trying to blend in with the civilian refugees who were flooding toward Saigon. The government in Saigon panicked, making contradictory decisions that only made the chaos worse. President Thieu ordered retreats and redeployments that pulled troops from positions that might have held and sent them to defend places that were already lost. The confusion at the top filtered down through the entire military structure, with units receiving conflicting orders and commanders unsure whether to stand or flee. Within weeks of the start of the offensive, the North Vietnamese were closing in on Saigon itself, and everyone knew that the end was near. For Nam Cao at the naval facility near Saigon, the signs were unmistakable. He could see the rockets now, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese artillery reaching the outskirts of the city, their explosions visible and audible from where he worked. The war that had seemed like it might go on forever was suddenly rushing toward a conclusion. And it was not going to be the conclusion that Nam Cao and millions of other South Vietnamese had hoped and worked and fought for. The question was no longer whether the South would fall, but when, and what you were going to do about it in the time that remained. Nam Cao made his decision. He was going to leave. He was not going to stay and find out what life under communist rule would be like for someone who had served as an officer in the military of the Republic of Vietnam. He knew what the communists did to people they considered enemies of the revolution. He had heard about the massacres during Tet, about the re-education camps where people were sent to be reformed through hard labor and political indoctrination. Some people who went to those camps came out after a few months or a year. Others were held for decades, and some never came out at all. As a naval officer, Nam Cao would be a target, someone the new regime would want to neutralize. His wife agreed. They would try to get out while they still could. The problem was how. The Americans had begun evacuating their own personnel and some Vietnamese who had worked closely with them. The famous helicopter evacuations that the whole world watched on television. But those official evacuations were limited in scope and carefully controlled. There were far more Vietnamese who wanted to leave than could possibly fit on the available helicopters and ships, and the American operation prioritized American citizens first, then Vietnamese who had direct ties to the American mission, leaving millions of others to fend for themselves. By the time Nam Cao was ready to move, most of the organized evacuations were over or winding down. He was going to have to find his own way out. Nam Cao had one advantage that most refugees did not have. He was a naval officer assigned to a facility that had boats. He gathered a small group of sailors who felt the same way he did. Men who had served in the Navy and knew how to operate the vessels. Men who had families they wanted to save, and no illusions about what would happen if they stayed. They chose a Mike boat, a landing craft that the Americans had given to the South Vietnamese Navy years earlier. A sturdy vessel designed to carry troops and equipment onto beaches. It wasn't designed for long ocean voyages, but it was seaworthy enough for what they had in mind. Nam Cao and his wife, along with the sailors and their families, slipped away from the base as the situation around Saigon continued to deteriorate, and headed downriver toward the coast. The rivers were choked with traffic now, boats of every description carrying people who were all trying to get to the same place, somewhere that wasn't about to fall to the communists. Some of the boats were overloaded and barely floating, packed with far more people than they could safely carry. Some were turned back by North Vietnamese forces who had already reached the riverbanks in places, cutting off escape routes that had been opened just days before. Some just ran out of fuel and drifted helplessly, their passengers stranded in the middle of the exodus. Nam Cao navigated through the chaos, using his experience on the rivers to find passages that were still open, avoiding the worst of the congestion and the greatest dangers. As they made their way downstream, other people begged to come aboard. Refugees who had no boats of their own and saw the Navy vessel as salvation. Nam Cao took on as many as he could, picking up strangers who became fellow travelers in the shared desperation to escape. By the time they reached the coast, he had accumulated about 60 people on his vessel, men and women and children who had been strangers a few days before, all of them now bound together by the hope that this boat could carry them to safety. At the coast, Nam Cao faced another crucial decision. The original plan, the plan that many refugees had, was to reach the American fleet, the Navy ships that were stationed offshore to pick up refugees and evacuees. But when Nam Cao got to the water and looked out at the horizon, trying to spot the American vessels, he realized they were much farther out than he had expected. The fleet had pulled back from the coast, positioned itself far enough offshore to be safe from any North Vietnamese interference. And that distance was a problem. The Mike boat that Nam Cao had was not designed for the open ocean. It could handle the rivers and the coastal waters without difficulty, but a long journey across the South China Sea to the American fleet was a different matter entirely. With 60 people aboard, many of them civilians with no experience on the water, a voyage that pushed the boat beyond its capabilities could easily end in disaster. Nam Cao had to make a choice based on imperfect information and his own judgment of the risks involved. He spotted another boat, larger and better suited for longer voyages, abandoned on the shore by others who had fled before him. Someone had taken that boat to the coast, been either found better transportation or been forced to leave it behind. For Nam Cao, it was an opportunity. He made the decision to transfer everyone to this better vessel and continue from there. But instead of trying for the American ships, which were still too far away to reach safely with the resources he had, he set a new course. Thailand. The neighboring country was closer, reachable with the fuel and supplies available, and the boat could make it if the weather held. So Nam Cao, the engineer who had rebuilt boats and learned to tell an AK-47 from an M16 by sound alone, now became the captain of a refugee vessel carrying 60 souls across the Gulf of Thailand toward an uncertain but hopeful destination. The journey was dangerous, with pirates operating in the waters, weather that could change without warning, and no guarantee that they would be welcomed when they arrived. But they made it. They reached Thailand and found safety, joining the growing population of Vietnamese refugees who had washed up on the shores of neighboring countries, all of them waiting to find out what would happen next. The refugee camp in Thailand was not a pleasant place, but it was safe. Nam Cao and his wife were alive, they were together, and they were out of Vietnam. The country they had known no longer existed. The Republic of Vietnam had surrendered on April 30th, 1975. The Communists had taken over, and Saigon had been renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the revolutionary leader who had died years earlier without seeing the reunification he had fought for. Everything Nam Cao had grown up with, everything he had worked for, the entire structure of his previous life, was gone. His engineering degree from a South Vietnamese university, his service record in the Republic of Vietnam Navy, his professional experience and his connections and his plans for the future, none of it meant anything anymore. He was a refugee now, starting over from zero, and he had to figure out what came next. The options for Vietnamese refugees in 1975 were limited but real. Several countries had agreed to accept refugees for resettlement, recognizing the humanitarian crisis and feeling some obligation to the people who had been their allies in the war. The United States was the most desirable destination for many Vietnamese refugees, including Nam Cao. America had been the great ally, the country that had fought alongside South Vietnam for more than a decade, the country that had sent its young men to die in Vietnam's jungles and rice paddies. It seemed like the logical place to start over, a country with economic opportunities and a large enough economy to absorb the wave of people who were arriving. The United States also felt an obligation to the refugees, or at least some Americans did, a sense that having fought to defend South Vietnam, they owed something to the people who were now fleeing the defeat. Not everyone agreed. There were Americans who wanted nothing more to do with Vietnam, who resented the idea of bringing in refugees from a war they wanted to forget. The politics of refugee resettlement were complicated and sometimes ugly, but the basic policy was set, and tens of thousands of Vietnamese refugees would eventually make their way to America. Nam Cao applied for resettlement in the United States and was accepted. He and his wife were processed through the system that had been hastily organized to handle the flood of refugees, were given their paperwork and their medical examinations and their briefings about what to expect, and were eventually put on a plane headed for their new country. The flight took them across the Pacific Ocean, tracing a route that connected the old world with the new. There was a stop in Alaska to refuel, and during that stop, Nam Cao got his first real look at his new country through the windows of the aircraft. He saw the snow covering everything, the white landscape stretching to the horizon, the ground crews bundled up in parkas and heavy gloves against the cold. Nam Cao was from a tropical country, a place where the temperature rarely dropped below what Americans would consider pleasant spring weather. He had never experienced real cold, had never seen snow except in photographs and movies. Now he was looking at a frozen landscape that seemed to belong to a different planet, and he wondered for a moment whether he had made a terrible mistake coming to this strange and frigid country. But there was no going back. The plane continued on, carrying him toward a future that was completely unknown. Nam Cao and his wife landed in the continental United States as refugees, two among the tens of thousands who arrived in those chaotic months after the fall of Saigon. The system for handling them channeled most of the refugees through a series of processing centers where they could be documented, given medical checkups, and matched with sponsors who would help them get started in their new lives. Nam Cao and his wife ended up at Indiantown Gap, a military installation in Pennsylvania that had been converted into one of the main refugee processing centers. Thousands of Vietnamese were there, filling barracks that had been built for American soldiers, eating in mess halls, waiting in lines for processing, all of them in the same situation of radical uncertainty. They had escaped Vietnam. They had made it to America. But what came next was unclear. They didn't speak English well, most of them. They didn't know American customs or American ways of doing things. They didn't have jobs or homes or any of the connections that make life work in a complex society. They had each other, and they had hope, and they had whatever skills and determination they had brought with them from the other side of the world. The key to getting out of the processing center and starting your real new life in America was finding a sponsor. A sponsor was an American individual or organization who would agree to take responsibility for helping you get settled, providing some initial support while you found your feet, helping you navigate the bureaucracies and find housing and employment. Churches sponsored many refugee families, seeing refugee assistance as a Christian duty and an opportunity for ministry. Community organizations and service clubs took on families. Some individual Americans, moved by what they had seen on television or feeling a personal connection to the war and its aftermath, stepped forward to sponsor complete strangers. Without a sponsor, you stayed in the camp, waiting, watching others leave while your own future remained on hold. Nam Cao was anxious to get out, to start working and building something, to take control of his own life again, instead of waiting for bureaucracies to decide his fate. But finding the right sponsor took time, and the match between sponsor and refugee was important. A bad match could leave both sides frustrated and make the transition to American life even harder than it already was. Then something fortunate happened. One of those small pieces of luck that can change the course of a life. Another refugee family in the camp had found a sponsor, but for whatever reason the match wasn't working out. Maybe there were personality conflicts, maybe the location wasn't right, maybe the sponsor's circumstances had changed. Whatever the reason, that family was looking to find a different sponsor, and they passed their original one to Nam Cao. It turned out to be a good fit. The sponsor was located in Boston, and Nam Cao and his wife prepared to head there to begin their American life in earnest. Boston in the mid-1970s was a city dealing with its own problems, the busing crisis and urban decay and economic stagnation. But it was also a city with a long history of absorbing immigrants, a tradition of organizations and institutions that helped newcomers find their place. The Vietnamese refugees who arrived in Boston found a city that was not always welcoming but offered real opportunities for those willing to work hard. Nam Cao spoke some English from his education in Vietnam and his interactions with American advisors during the war, but functioning fully in an English-speaking society was still an enormous challenge. Everything was unfamiliar, from the food to the weather to the pace of life, to the way people interacted with each other. The cold was brutal for someone who had grown up in the tropical heat of Vietnam. The cultural differences were constant, small surprises, things that Americans took for granted, but that Vietnamese found strange or confusing. But Nam Cao was an engineer, and engineers solve problems. He approached his new life as a series of challenges to be analyzed and overcome, applying the same systematic thinking that had served him in the Navy. He figured out how to get a job, how to navigate the American bureaucracy, how to find an apartment and set up a household. The skills he had learned in the Navy, the discipline and the technical knowledge and the ability to function under pressure, all of that transferred to civilian life in a new country. He found employment in his field, using the mechanical skills that were valuable in any economy and any situation. He established himself, began to build credit and reputation, started the long process of creating a new life in a country that had been completely unknown to him just months before. The Vietnamese refugee community in Boston grew as more people arrived and settled. creating networks of mutual support and cultural connection that helped newcomers find their way. There was one painful absence in this new life, and it weighed on Nam Cao and his wife constantly. When they had fled Vietnam in those desperate final days, they had not been able to bring everyone with them. Their daughter had stayed behind, living with Nam Cao's parents, left in the care of family because there hadn't been time or space or certainty enough to bring her on the dangerous journey. In the chaos of the evacuation, in the desperate rush to get out before the communists arrived, they had made the agonizing decision that parents sometimes have to make, leaving a child behind with the hope of reuniting later. A hope that must have seemed reasonable at the time, but that the closing of the borders made impossibly difficult to fulfill. For years after the fall of Saigon, Nam Cao had no way to see his daughter, no way to bring her to America, no reliable way even to communicate with his family back in Vietnam. The communist government restricted travel and communication, treating anyone who had fled as a traitor and regarding their relatives who remained with suspicion. The relationship between the United States and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam was hostile, with no diplomatic ties, no direct communication channels, no easy way to bridge the enormous gap that had opened between the refugees in America and the families they had left behind. Letters were unreliable, censored by the government, sometimes never delivered at all. Phone calls were virtually impossible. The separation that was supposed to be temporary stretched into years, and then into decades. Waiting, hope. Nam Cao focused on what he could control, building his career and his life in America, saving money, establishing himself as a solid citizen of his new country. But the separation from his daughter never stopped hurting, a wound that wouldn't heal as long as she remained out of reach. Then, gradually, things began to change in Vietnam. The immediate post-war period had been harsh, with the communist government implementing collective agriculture and nationalizing businesses and sending hundreds of thousands of people to re-education camps. The economy collapsed, partly from the disruption of the war and partly from ideological policies that didn't work in practice. By the 1980s, the Vietnamese government was beginning to recognize that something had to change, and they started implementing economic reforms known as Doi Moi, renovation, opening up to foreign investment and allowing private enterprise to re-emerge. The changes were gradual and incomplete, but they represented a significant shift from the rigid ideology of the immediate post-war years. The relationship between Vietnam and the United States began to thaw as well, slowly and with many setbacks, but moving in a direction that would eventually lead to normalization. The American government began allowing Vietnamese Americans to return to Vietnam for visits, a change that was momentous for people who had been completely cut off from their homeland and their families. Programs were established to allow former refugees to sponsor family members for immigration to the United States, creating legal pathways for family reunification that had not existed before. Nam Cao seized the opportunity as soon as it became available. He went back to Vietnam for the first time since his escape, returning to the country that had been his home for the first decades of his life, a country that was now under a completely different system of government. It was strange and emotional, seeing the familiar places transformed by years of communist rule, walking streets that he remembered but that now had different names, reconnecting with family members who had lived through years of hardship and uncertainty. The Vietnam he returned to was both familiar and alien, a place that triggered intense memories while also reminding him constantly of everything that had changed. But the most important part of the trip was seeing his daughter again, the child he had left behind who was now a young woman, grown up in a different country under a different system, shaped by experiences that her father had not shared. The reunion was joyful and painful at the same time, joy at being together again after so many years, pain at all the time that had been lost, all the experiences that had not been shared, all the ordinary moments of family life that had been stolen by history and politics, and the hard choices of war and its aftermath. Nam Cao was eventually able to bring his daughter to the United States through the family reunification provisions of American immigration law. It took time and patience and mountains of paperwork, navigating the bureaucracies of two governments that were still deeply suspicious of each other, but finally his family was together again in America. The wound that had been open since 1975 could finally begin to heal, even though the scars would never completely disappear. Looking back on all of it now, on the student deferment and the Tet Offensive, and the years in the Navy, and the desperate escape and the refugee camps, and the decades of building a new life in America, Nam Cao has reached a place of peace that might have seemed impossible in the bitter years right after losing his country. The anger and the grief that he felt when South Vietnam fell, when everything he had known was swept away. Those feelings were real, and they were powerful. But holding on to bitterness doesn't change anything that happened, and it makes your own life harder and smaller. Nam Cao has let go of most of that bitterness, not because he has forgotten what happened or because he thinks it didn't matter, but because he has chosen to focus on what he can build rather than what was lost. The war was a tragedy for everyone involved. For the Americans who went there to fight and came home changed, or didn't come home at all. For the South Vietnamese who lost their country and their freedom, and yes, even for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, who paid an enormous price in blood for their victory. More than 1 million Vietnamese died in the war, soldiers and civilians on both sides of the conflict, and millions more had their lives disrupted and diminished in ways that took decades to overcome, if they ever did. The boat people, the refugees who fled by sea in the years after 1975, died by the thousands in the South China Sea, victims of storms and pirates and boats that were never meant for ocean voyages. Nam Cao was one of the lucky ones. He got out. He found safety. He made it to America. He built a successful life and reunited with his family. Many others were not so fortunate. Many others died in the fighting or in the camps or on the boats, or simply lived out diminished lives in a Vietnam that had become something very different from what they had hoped for. The story of the Vietnamese refugees is one of the great migration stories of the 20th century, an exodus of more than 1 million people fleeing political persecution and economic hardship, risking everything for the chance at a new life somewhere else. They settled in the United States in largest numbers, but also in France and Australia and Canada and Germany and all over the world, bringing with them their culture and their work ethic and their determination to build something from nothing. They faced discrimination and hardship in their new countries, struggled with languages and customs that were foreign to them, worked jobs that were beneath their qualifications and education. But they persevered, and they raised children who went to American schools and became doctors and engineers and teachers and artists, who grew up speaking English as their first language while keeping connections to a Vietnamese heritage that their parents and grandparents had carried with them across the ocean. The Vietnamese American community today is a testament to what refugees can accomplish when given the chance, when a country opens its doors and allows people to rebuild their lives. It's not a simple or uncomplicated story. The war that created the refugees was controversial and divisive, and the wounds from that era have never fully healed. The Vietnamese American community itself is diverse and divided, with different political views and different relationships to the homeland they left behind. But the basic human story of people fleeing danger and building new lives, that story is universal and timeless, and it deserves to be remembered and honored. Nam Cao's advice to others, the wisdom he has gained from living through all of this, from experiencing loss and displacement and the long, hard work of reconstruction, is simple to state but difficult to follow. Be positive. Keep an open mind. Don't let the bitterness of the past poison the possibilities of the future. It's easy to say those words, much harder to actually live them, when you have lost everything and had to start over from nothing, when you have been separated from your child for years, when the country of your birth has been transformed into something you barely recognize. Nam Cao has lived that advice, has embodied it through decades of building and growing and healing. It's something worth thinking about for all of us, whatever our circumstances and whatever losses we may have experienced. When you really step back and think about what Nam Cao went through, from those days as a student in Saigon, hoping the war would somehow pass him by, to the terrifying chaos of the Tet Offensive, to the years of service in the Navy, keeping boats running and supplies moving through hostile waters, to that final desperate flight on a crowded vessel with 60 strangers who had become his responsibility. It's a journey that tests everything a person has. And then, to arrive in a completely foreign country with nothing but what you could carry, to have to rebuild from zero, to work and save and struggle while your daughter grew up on the other side of the world, to wait years and then decades for the chance to see her again. That takes a kind of strength that doesn't make headlines but matters more than almost anything. Before we finish, it's worth just sitting with this story for a moment, letting it sink in beyond the facts and the dates and the sequence of events. Nam Cao wasn't a general who made strategic decisions that affected the course of the war. He wasn't a politician who shaped policy or a diplomat who negotiated treaties. He was an engineering student who got caught up in events far beyond his control and had to figure out how to survive and how to protect the people he loved. That's what most people in most wars are actually doing. Not making history, but living through it. Trying to make the right choices when none of the choices are good, hoping that luck and skill and determination will be enough to carry them through to the other side. The Vietnam War ended almost 50 years ago now, passing out of current events and into history, becoming something that younger people learn about in school, rather than something they remember. The veterans who served, American and Vietnamese alike, are growing older, their numbers diminishing with each passing year. The refugees who fled are now grandparents, their children and grandchildren thoroughly American, even as they maintain connections to a Vietnamese heritage that grows more distant with each generation. The war that shaped so many lives is becoming a chapter in textbooks, its passions and controversies cooling with the passage of time. But the human stories, the individual experiences of people like Nam Cao, those retain their power to move us and teach us, regardless of how much time has passed. They remind us that behind every statistic about casualties or refugees or economic impacts, there are real human beings with hopes and fears and families, people who laughed and loved and suffered and persevered. They remind us that history is not just something that happens to nations and armies, but something that happens to people. Ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and have to decide what kind of person they are going to be. Nam Cao decided to be someone who kept going, who rebuilt when things fell apart, who chose hope over bitterness and connection over isolation. That's a choice that's available to all of us, whatever our circumstances, and it's a choice that makes all the difference in what kind of life we end up living. His story is one thread in the enormous tapestry of the Vietnam War and its aftermath, but it's a thread that matters because it's true, because it happened to a real person who made real choices and lived with real consequences. And that thread, when you trace it carefully, shows us something important about human resilience, about the capacity to start over and to find meaning even after devastating loss. That's not a political message or an argument about who was right and who was wrong in a war that divided nations. It's just a human truth, earned through experience and offered to anyone willing to listen. Nam Cao's journey from Saigon to Boston, from student to sailor to refugee to American, is complete now, in the sense that he has built the life he set out to build. Vietnamese-American achievement. But stories like his are never really complete, because they continue in the children and grandchildren who carry forward what was preserved and what was created. The sacrifices and the struggles of one generation become the inheritance of the next, not as a burden, but as a foundation, something to build upon and learn from. That's how history actually works, not as a series of events that end, but as a continuous flow of human experience, each generation connected to those that came before and those that will come after. However you feel about the Vietnam War, whatever conclusions you draw about the decisions that were made and the prices that were paid, the people who lived through it deserve to be remembered, not as symbols or arguments, but as human beings who did the best they could with what they had. Nam Cao is one of those people, and his story is worth knowing.